Good afternoon. A filter, a cocoon, nest-making material, ghost clothes, molted skin. For years, this object was the mysterious apparition of my childhood imagination, a fantastical object that's utility could have been limitless, and indeed was in my mind. When this object was not, however, sitting just out of reach on top of my grandmother's dresser, and was instead on her body, the fantasy seemed to narrow, a head covering. As an appendage of my heritage that bore no direct relationship on my own physical body, this is the term by which I came to know and interpret these pieces of netted tulle. However, even with this term, head covering, which makes the object's function seem obvious, the garments that were so much a part of my Mennonite ancestors' daily life have for me simply evaded straightforward meaning. Having rarely handled the head coverings that were worn regularly by women in my family for decades, I recently asked my aunt to pull them out of storage so I could have a look at their unique and curious structures. Standing at her kitchen table, she handed me the head coverings that were once worn by herself and two of her sisters. Though the coverings felt brittle and skeletal, they were still forgiving to my touch and still willing to speak as I placed them side by side, lining up like commas or quotation marks. The head coverings, aged from both time and lack of light, suddenly really did seem to be molted skin, only now being the skin of a religious body that once used these garments ritualistically and then stopped. Though the coverings were not necessarily fragile, I was aware of them as encrypted materials that were nonetheless fixed in aging forms. Assuming that my aunt had them folded up as they appear here, in order to save space in storage, I asked her, why are the coverings folded and pressed with such deliberate precision? My aunt answered that her coverings were pressed so flat because she and her sisters stored them in their Bibles when they weren't wearing them. I am interested in both sides of this, the scriptural reference that indoctrinated these objects, as well as the lived experiences of the bodies that wore or still wear them, but mostly I am stuck in the lyrical proposition that my aunt unexpectedly articulated. It is the image of all of these components, words, garments, and bodies pressed together between pages, that is immediately evocative. A filter, a cocoon, a net, a head covering, a textile used as a medium to communicate within and around a collective identity, or a text. The word text comes from textus, Latin for tissue, which foregrounds the word as both a physical and metaphysical apparatus that functions as a binding agent and communicates language. Looking at the covering, my eye becomes aware of each singular fiber that, together with others around it, play an integral role in holding together the integrity of the textile's form. At first glance, the textile's pattern appears to be created by a cross-hatching stitch, though upon further inspection, the weave more closely mimics a honeycomb, a textile of individual fibers drawn around interrelated and touching nodes. As I imagined as a child, there are many functions that utilize the same material for its permeability. This textile is emblematic of what poet Lynn Haginian might describe as a form that provides an opening, or what poet and literary theorist Lisa Robertson might call a mediating skin or a linguistic dermis. In the mid-19th century, when the majority of Mennonites were emigrating to North America and their dress rituals were first codified, an unconventional text was needed to replace the loss of German, their shared spoken language. Begun by Menno Simons in the 16th century, the Mennonites are a sect of Anabaptist Christianity, a denomination that proliferated during the Radical Reformation. Simons was from the Netherlands, though attracted many early followers of his new faith from Swiss, German, and Russian origins. The Mennonites self-identified with foundational commitments to adult baptism, social justice, and pacifism. In Europe, their pacifism required them to relocate from countries where their faith was in opposition to forced military conscription, as is illustrated in this wood engraving from the Martyr's Mere. This made the Mennonites largely a people of diaspora. In their various emigrations to North America, many mainstream influences began to fracture Mennonite experience, one of the most notable of them being the loss of an original language. Thus, nearly 350 years after the Mennonites' first assembly, and when displaced in new countries, the codification of dress, which included the head covering, emerged as an ethnic symbol of resistance, an intimate gesture of identity, and a language unto its own. Despite being an old and growing religion, the popular use of Mennonite dress was only sustained for a small fraction of time, from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s. This brief appearance of the Mennonite body dressed in traditional clothes does not endure an explanation of it only as a theological ritual. Instead, I propose that the garments were worn for the textile's strength as a social tissue, as a way for members of a disparate community to connect to one another through intimate embodied rituals and objects. It could be said that any adornment of the body that serves as a visual mark of identity is an act of text-making, inasmuch as writing is a process for creating legible space for self-perception and relationship with the outside world. Rather than an idea of language as static and fixed, or something that abstractly controls its speakers in a realm outside of the physical, the Mennonites' visual linguistic system, written by bodies, makes clear that the transmission of language is absolutely dependent on human agency. The ephemerality of this text of garments that exists within a cloth that comes routinely on and off the body says that language too is something that we put on, that we climb into, and that we present physically based on societal or spiritual needs. However, rather than representing a universality of language, the physical appearance of Mennonite head coverings varied greatly depending on ethnic origin and level of conservatism. The white net head covering that beheld my fascination were those belonging to Mennonites of Swiss-German origins, but they differ greatly from the coverings of Mennonite women of Prussian-Russian descent and those who immigrated directly to Latin American countries. Perhaps this code could be more aptly thought of as different dialects that utilize the same vocabulary to represent a local rhythm that withstands and adapts to transliteration. Lisa Robertson defines intimate, locally constructed language as vernacular, a word with etymological roots not only in Latin's verna, meaning domestic and native, but also of spring, vernal. Robertson recognizes vernaculars as a form of language that is composed less by the familiarity of specific words or phrases, and more so as a productive social space, a condition for emergence. Robertson writes that vernacular does not produce identity, but instead nourishes, anticipates, and is vulnerable to it. As materials of vernacular language, the coverings must not be considered to be starting or stopping points of Mennonite identification, but rather along a continuum of the Mennonite history as it has been continually animated. The coverings themselves, even when popularly used, were not productive of Mennonitism, but certainly propelled the collective energy necessary in writing its social text. A text needs a lexicon of words or figures that do the writing and carry out the articulation and action of a narrative or message. In addition to words, texts often rely on punctuation, visual marks that elicit pause, inflection, and rhythm. Texts need context, placement in time around other information, with references to the histories that it hopes to either align with or subvert. In the 1960s, half a century or more since the largest populations of Mennonites had arrived in North America, preservation of a dress code no longer bolstered Mennonite identity. While the need for a cohesive visual language could be argued either way, the scholarship of second-wave feminism and many Mennonites' resonance with it made clear that the particular symbolism of female head covering was no longer proving to be a language that was generous to the platforms of kinship, equality, and spiritual growth. It could be easily imagined that a kind of dismantling of Mennonite identity might have ensued when the majority of ritual attire was indeed taken off of individual bodies and left behind in storage chests, like shadows or quotations from another time. However, words too change rapidly, at times becoming archaic or obsolete, but they are hardly ever buried entirely, especially after they've been recorded, materialized, and written into text. Because there is more to be read in a text than just words, texts need a lingering material host that can be physically encountered by readers at different times. The Mennonite coverings are only material artifacts of a vernacular's energy, but as artifacts, they become illustrative of David Morgan and Sally Prommy's claim that specimens of material culture are not simply things to be read or decoded and then discarded, but rather are forms that continually give words, stories, and ideas a time and a place to happen. In this instance, I take this to mean in every textile a text, and in every text a social tissue. The traces left behind in the material structure offer innumerable poetic and political interpretations. The indeterminacy of these interpretations visually proclaim linguistic communities to be sustained only as long as they are embodied organisms. The history of Mennonite dress tells us that the evolution of linguistic forms should not cause a renounced faith in language, but rather a celebrated surrender to the illusion of a static and permanent control over it. Robertson writes that, quote, even the most temporary membranes serve as shelter, and among these membranes, speaking begins, end quote. As with any hermeneutic specimen, the exegesis of the Mennonite head coverings will forever be evolving and subject to reinterpretation, always at a place of beginning. They are vestigial garments, but these head coverings, sheer, ethereal, and mysterious, will continually serve as incubators for new ideas, cocoons or nests after all. Thank you.